On a gray autumn morning in 1895, a young American bride walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in New York. She was draped in an opulent wedding gown of ivory and lace, its sweeping train intricately embroidered with silver thread. Every eye in the room, most especially her mother's, was fixed upon her as she slowly moved forward. Yet, behind the delicate veil, tears streamed down her face. Consuelo was born on March 2, 1877 in New York City, the first of 3 children and the only daughter of William Kissam and Alva Erskine Vanderbilt. She carried the bloodline of America's wealthiest family, her father being the grandson of the famous railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt. Her childhood home was the opulent Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, a grand mansion designed by Richard Morris Hunt under Alva Vanderbilt's strict guidance and taste for decadence. Alva named her daughter after her close friend Consuelo Montague, a Cuban-American socialite who had dazzled New York City by marrying into British nobility, a pursuit Alva had her sights on for her daughter from the moment she was born. Because she was a girl, Consuelo was never destined to inherit her father's business empire as her brothers were. Instead, she was fashioned into a tool for even greater ambition, the pursuit of a royal title. Under her mother's domineering hand and her father's indifference, Consuelo's childhood was rigid, disciplined, and controlled. At just 10, her mother began forcing her to wear a steel rod against her spine, buckled to her waist and shoulders, to uphold her perfect posture. Her mother would often whip her with a riding crop, sometimes as punishment for perceived defiance, but other times for no other reason than to demonstrate to Consuelo her littleness. She never attended public schooling, but rather was educated at home, mostly by a private tutor, but sometimes alongside a small circle made up of daughters of the wealthy elite. This arrangement allowed her mother to supervise her daughter's education, ensuring that every lesson would shape her into the kind of cultured, accomplished young woman who would attract the attention of Europe's aristocracy. She was extremely bright, and by her teenage years already well-versed in French, German, Italian, and Spanish. Of course, mastery of these languages was not just academic. It would ensure Consuelo could navigate European high society with ease. She was taught to withhold her opinion and obey rather than question. Once, Consuelo objected to the clothing her mother had chosen for her. To this sign of defiance, her mother responded, "I do the thinking, you do as you are told." As Consuelo grew, others began to notice her beauty. Her sleek, elegant appearance perfectly embodied beauty standards of the Edwardian era. The playwright Sir James Barrie, author of Peter Pan, even recalled how he would stand all day in the street just to see Consuelo get into her carriage. Another acquaintance recalled how he was captivated by her piquant oval face perched upon a long, slender neck, her enormous dark eyes fringed with curling lashes, her dimples, and her tiny teeth when she smiled. By the time she reached her teenage years, suitors from all corners lined up to court her, many bearing royal titles. She had 5 proposals of marriage, including one from Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg, which Consuelo declined. But to Alva, none were worthy of her daughter, or rather, none had titles high enough nor estates big enough to match the expectations she envisioned for her daughter. Out of all these suitors, one man caught the eye of Consuelo. At just 17, she fell in love with Winthrop Rutherford, an American socialite 15 years her senior. It may come as no surprise that Alva was completely opposed to the match, but despite her mother's objection, for the first time Consuelo rebelled. She continued meeting Rutherford, and even agreed to a secret engagement the night before she was forced by her mother to leave on a 5-month trip to Europe. Rutherford followed them on this journey, but Alva forbade him from seeing Consuelo and even intercepted their letters to ensure all ties were cut. But Alva's objection to the match wasn't merely because she was still finding a suitor with a high title. It was because she had found a suitor with a high title. Through her connections, she learned of Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who was highly indebted due to lavish spending and mismanagement of funds. With his financial troubles, it was advantageous for him to trade his title for the money of a wealthy heiress. These American women who married into European nobility were known as dollar princesses. For Alva, it was also advantageous for another reason. She had recently divorced her husband, Consuelo's father, an act that was extremely taboo at the time for high-class individuals. Because of this, she was shunned from elite society. If she could manage to marry her daughter to a real duke, she would surely be once again accepted. Consuelo continued to refuse this scheme, planning to elope with Rutherford instead. Upon hearing this, her mother locked her in her room until she agreed, and even threatened to shoot Rutherford should he attempt to interfere in her daughter's future anymore. Consuelo refused to yield until Alva claimed that her health was failing, warning that she might not survive unless Consuelo obeyed. Finally, Consuelo conceded, and her mother made an astonishing recovery from her supposed illness. On November 6, 1895, a heartbroken Consuelo married the Duke of Marlborough in a lavish ceremony at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. The Duke negotiated a settlement of $42.5 million in Vanderbilt Railroad stock, as well as an annual allowance of $100,000. The streets surrounding the church bristled with police officers, holding back the restless crowd that pressed closer to the ceremony. It is said that Consuelo stood at the altar, weeping behind her veil. After the ceremony, the Duke allegedly told her he was in love with another woman, and apparently declared he despised anything that was not British. Consuelo was only 18, and already the familiar bustle of New York streets had been replaced by the serene grandeur of Blenheim Palace in England. Suddenly, Consuelo had to undertake new responsibility outside mere social appearances. To begin, she was faced with the momentous task of managing such an enormous estate, especially due to her husband's ineptitude of managing money. This included not only household maintenance, but also day-to-day responsibilities of servants. Simultaneously, she also had to navigate British aristocratic society, and was expected to throw lavish parties, social gatherings, and charitable events to bolster her and her husband's social position. But she took on these tasks with such grace that she was much adored as the new Duchess of Marlborough, not least by the poorer tenants of the estate, whom she would often visit. And, in addition to all this, she was expected to bear male heirs. At her first meeting with the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo was told, "Your first duty is to have a child, and it must be a son, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke." The Winston referred to is Winston Churchill, who was the cousin of the Duke. In 1897, Consuelo gave birth to her first son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, Marquess of Blandford, and just a year later, in 1898, her second son, Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill. She felt protective of her children, wanting them to have more opportunity and independence than she had, although she was often limited in expressing her affection freely due to her social position. She began a number of philanthropic projects, taking particular interest in assisting mothers and children. It may come as no surprise that Consuelo and the Duke had a loveless marriage. The Duke saw his wife as merely a useful tool to solidify his wealth. Only a few years into the marriage, Consuelo reconnected with Rutherford. She even went to spend 2 weeks with him in Paris, and declared to her husband that she loved Rutherford and desired to elope with him. In 1900, she went to London to discuss the possibility of an elopement, but Rutherford refused. The Duke left for South Africa for 6 months, during which time Consuelo confessed to having an affair with his cousin, Reginald Fellows. Of her several following affairs, it is speculated she had a relationship with Paul César Helleux, an artist who painted her portrait numerous times. Of course, the Duke had his own affairs during this time as well, and in 1906, Consuelo and the Duke finally separated, divorcing in 1921. Consuelo recalled, "We had been married 11 years, and life together had not brought us closer. Time had but accentuated our differences. The nervous tension that tends to grow between people of different temperament condemned to live together had reached its highest pitch." In 1926, the Duke requested, with Consuelo's consent, that the marriage be annulled. To the shock of all, Alva was supportive of this decision. In court, she testified, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." After her first marriage, Consuelo moved to Sunderland House, an estate purchased by her father in London to entertain guests during the social season. It was at this point in her life that she began to find independence in a world that constantly tried to confine her. She became a strong advocate for the Liberal Party's welfare agenda, which included reforms such as free school meals, free medical inspections for children, and national workers' insurance. Like her mother, Consuelo became a supporter of women's suffrage, having in 1913 been elected chairwoman of the Women's Municipal Party. During World War I, she worked as the chair of the Economic Relief Committee for the American Women's War Relief Fund. She continued to maintain ties with the Churchill family, specifically Winston Churchill, who was, coincidentally, the son of American heiress Jenny Jerome. Consuelo eventually married again in 1921 to Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Balzan, a dashing French aviator. This marriage would last all the way until Balzan's death in 1956, and Consuelo would always describe it as a marriage of love. The couple lived happily at their chateau in northern France. Alva, who was growing older, also bought a chateau of her own in France to be nearer her daughter, this time not to control, but simply to act as a companion. The two enjoyed an easier relationship later in Consuelo's life, marked by mutual respect and a softer understanding that had been absent on the part of her mother in earlier years. During the years of peace between the two world wars, Consuelo and singer-sewing machine heiress Winnaretta Singer worked together to construct the Foch Hotel in a suburb of Paris, intended to care for middle-class workers. In 1940, Consuelo and her husband were forced to evacuate France to escape Nazi invasion, and instead lived in their home in Florida, which had been built in 1932 and named Casa Alva in honor of her mother, who died in 1933. It is believed it was here that Winston Churchill wrote his renowned Iron Curtain speech while he was visiting Consuelo. In 1953, she wrote her autobiography, The Glitter and Gold, although many have questioned its authenticity. She died in Long Island, New York on December 6, 1964, at the age of 87, and was buried near her younger son in the churchyard of St. Martin's Church in England, only a few miles from Blenheim Palace. Consuelo's story is far richer than the label of a dollar princess. True, she was born into staggering wealth, but this only intensified the heavy burdens and expectations of a Gilded Age socialite. Could you have endured the weight of such control and still claimed a life of your own? Though wronged beyond measure, Consuelo always chose kindness over resentment. Her life serves as a lesson in strength, reminding us that identity is not inherited, but forged through the lives we live.